This video contains spoilers for Mistborn Eras 1 and 2. Unless you are deathly allergic to spoilers, stick around. In 2022, Brandon Sanderson announced that Hollywood came calling. As such, there have been murmurings and speculation about various Cosmere movies and shows, fan casting choices, as well as general head-scratching about how it's possible to bring Sanderson's works to life without ruining them. If you don't know anything about Mistborn, and you're simply watching this video to have an informed opinion on the films, whilst sipping champagne and sampling caviar with your cinephile friends, the closest analogy to Mistborn in visual media is Avatar: The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra. Mistborn's first era takes place in a high fantasy magic setting with medieval levels of technology, and somewhat medieval social structures, which changes in Era 2 to a world with electricity, trains, and democracy. Mistborn's first series tells an overarching story between the three books, where the main characters have a direct effect on the most important events of their time. Era 2 is more self-contained adventure stories, with individual crimes to be solved, and action set pieces on moving trains and through skyscrapers. Mistborn Era 1 has 3 books, Avatar: The Last Airbender has 3 seasons. Same is true of Mistborn Era 2, 4 books, and Legend of Korra, 4 seasons. A lot of fans of the original Mistborn trilogy are not as big fans of Era 2 because it's a completely different genre. And the same is true of Legend of Korra. But both Mistborn Era 2 and Korra are solid stories. They're just not to the same level of epicness or the same flavor of epicness as their predecessors. If Legend of Korra had come out before Avatar: The Last Airbender, it may have been better received. It's just hard to stack up well against perfection. The biggest difference between Mistborn Era 2 and Korra is that Wax and Wayne stick the landing a lot better than Korra does. When it comes to intellectual properties, Hollywood tends to ruin them, not preserve them. It is so much easier to ruin Mistborn Era 1 than it is to ruin Era 2. So let's make it as easy on the filmmakers as possible. Give them some training wheels before telling them to direct a masterpiece trilogy that will be the beginning of a cinematic universe unlike the world has ever seen. No matter how good these movies might be, you're never going to get every diehard fan of the books on board with them. But if Hollywood decides to do what they did with The Witcher or The Rings of Power, they're not going to keep any fans at all. The target audience of these movies is going to be both Sanderson fans and people who are unfamiliar with Sanderson and just want to see a good fantasy movie. Now, to the true fans who know the lore probably better than the producers will, it's less important that the story be told in order and more important that it be told faithfully. The fans already know where the story is going to go, so what will keep them happy is that the story is told according to Sanderson's vision of it. If these movies mess up an important part of how allomancy works, that might be enough for a large portion of the fan base to lose faith in the entire series, because of how important the magic system is to this setting. And allomancy is only one of 3 magic systems that exist within this world, so that's going to be a lot to explain to new audiences. In this setting, the people who can use magic ingest various different metals, and depending upon the metal, they get a variety of different powers. Steel, for instance, allows one to push on various steel objects, which allows them to shoot coins at people or fly. Iron is the opposite, it allows people to pull on metal objects. There are many different abilities. Some people only have access to one of these powers, but in the first era, the titular Mistborn have access to all of the powers. And that means a movie with a Mistborn in it has to explain them all. That works great in the book, but even if the original Mistborn movie were to be 3.5 hours long, that's a lot to expect of a new audience to keep track of every single power that the main characters have. And magic aside, the audience would also need to keep track of the many plot points that are necessary in order to make the original Mistborn as awesome as it needs to be. In Era 2, however, magic has become diluted over time. It is much less powerful and there are no Mistborn left. So the only thing that the filmmakers need to explain is that Wax can fling metal and fly, Wayne can heal and slow time in a bubble around himself, and Marasi has the opposite power to Wayne. So the original Mistborn trilogy You really have to pay attention to a whole bunch of things that are going on, whereas Mistborn Era 2 is a little bit more like a superhero movie where people have very easily graspable powers. Let's look at the worst case scenario here. Hollywood makes the original Mistborn trilogy in a way where they disappoint and alienate their core fan base, make panicked changes to the second movie in order to try to get them back and thereby make it worse, and then turn Hero of Ages into an absolute abomination that no one wants to rewatch and derails the entire Cosmere. On the other hand, if they make the Wax and Wayne series reasonably enjoyable, break even at the box office, and don't leave the audience with any ill will, there's no harm done to the Sanderson brand. And even if these movies are terrible, they're much easier to sweep under the rug than if you mess up the first trilogy. Well, not always. People seem to be enjoying The House of the Dragon just fine. The main problem with prequels is that it's difficult to build any sort of tension when you know that all of the characters that exist in the sequels are going to be fine, they're all going to survive, and it's a pretty good indicator that if they don't survive, then they die in the prequels, so it cuts out a lot of that tension. But the Alloy of Law takes place hundreds of years after Era 1 ends, so there are actually very few spoilers, and presumably there's no characters that do survive from Era 1 to Era 2, right? Anyway, even if you hate prequels as a general rule, Vin's trilogy, the original trilogy, also takes place after the Lord Ruler's Ascent, and there are flashbacks in the first series of books that explain yet another era of Mistborn. Having Vin's story be told as something of a mythological tale that's referenced back from Wax and Wayne's time might actually make it feel even more consistent when we go back to the original trilogy and see the Lord Ruler's tale played out. Hollywood is really bad at making epic fantasy movies. If we leave out TV shows, how many epic fantasy movies has Hollywood made recently, or even arguably ever, that are actually good? And that's it. To find a really good fantasy movie before The Lord of the Rings, you have to go back to, like, Jason and the Argonauts. I don't like those odds for Mistborn. On the other hand, something that Hollywood is actually very good at is making action movies. Recent movies like the John Wick franchise have some of the best gunplay ever put to screen. And I, for one, would love to see what those choreographers could do with allomancy mixed into their gunfights. In fact, the blueprint for successful Wax and Wayne movies already exists. The Guy Ritchie Sherlock Holmes films have the correct flow of action, where things slow down, where you can see everything that's going on in Holmes' mind, would fit really well with Wayne's speed bubbles.
First, pillage the nest. Clip wings. Now, blunt his beak. Crack eggs. Scramble. Pinch of salt. Touch of pepper. Flip the omelette. Additional seasoning required. Breakfast is served.
The dialogue and general tone have a beautiful mix of seriousness and levity that is also reflected in the Wax and Wayne books.
I like the hat.
Oh, I just picked it up.
Do you remember your revolver?
Oh, knew I forgot something. Thought I'd left the stove on.
You did.
And the chemistry between the actors is really good as well. So you could even just take the cast from the Sherlock Holmes movies and plop them into Mistborn, and it would work really well. Jude Law would be a solid Wax. Robert Downey Jr. would be a phenomenal Wayne. Marassi needs an actress that makes her hard-nosed dedication relatable, which Rachel McAdams would do perfectly. And though I'm not as familiar with Kelly Riley's filmography, she fits Asteris really well. All of them are a bit old for these roles, but they're also highly competent actors, and that might be worth the benefit. But there are plenty of good casting choices for most of these characters, so go for whoever fits the roles. Another benefit of doing Era 2 first is that it's much easier to cast than Era 1. If they get Vin or Kelsier wrong, the movies are dead on arrival. There is admittedly a small problem with Era 2 coming out before Era 1, having to do with spoilers, and that is namely the Lost Metal. The little connections between the two series basically are just Easter eggs up until the Lost Metal, but here there are some serious connections that one will miss unless they are familiar with the first trilogy. The best solution to this is to release the first 3 Wax and Wayne movies first, then return to do the original trilogy, and finish it off with the Lost Metal. The Hero of Ages, the 3rd book in the first trilogy, is going to be very difficult to adapt no matter what the filmmakers do. So something that might make it more palatable for new audiences is to see the connections to Era 2 as the story's going on. So in this hypothetical ideal situation, the first 3 Wax and Wayne movies are out, they're a success. The original trilogy with Vin and Kelsier is nearing completion. The studio would keep the filming of The Lost Metal as secret as possible, and then release a trailer for it during the screenings of The Hero of Ages. Imagine, if you will, the theater is filled with fans eagerly awaiting the conclusion of the original Mistborn trilogy, excited to see Vin save the world from ruin. The ordinary non-Cosmere trailers play without event, but then a final trailer begins with a monologue. It's been years since I set aside my guns. Years of peace, fulfillment, satisfaction. Instead of enforcing the law, now I help form it. The shadows of my past have been faced. The dead have been mourned. And now I look to the future. Still there are troubles. Unseen enemies cause unrest in the outer cities. Our neighbors across the sea threaten war. These struggles are erupting into violence, and action must be taken. I do what I can to maintain harmony in the Senate. I come armed with words and open hands, to convince, to persuade. But in the end, that may not be enough. In the end, I am not Harmony's hands. I'm his sword. At that point, even if you're disappointed by the conclusion of Hero of Ages, you know you're still going to go watch that last Wax and Wayne movie. While we're dreaming here, we're going to make these made-up studio executives put Allomancer Jack and Nikki Savage animated shorts at the beginning of each of these Era 2 movies, with the terrible dialogue and absolutely over-the-top ridiculous scenarios that they find themselves in, and advertisements at the end from Immerling Arms and Vif Sparkle Tonic. It would be such a great way to both give exposition as to how allomantic powers work and also to immerse the audience in this world even more. Curse that fool Jack.